Okay, so today we are going to have the first of two parts of a series called Our Values in Theory and in Practice. My name is Dan Spiro. I'm the president of the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society of Washington. I want to thank you all for coming. We have really two exciting panelists to get this started. The first session is going to be about Judaism, and the second session is going to be about Islam, and that will be either in December or January. We have not come up with a precise date yet. And so I'm going to introduce the panelists, and I want to I'll introduce you one at a time, and then I'll start out with Rabbi Schneier, who I think is going to get started, and then after he finishes, I'll introduce the other panelists. So Rabbi David Schneier is the founder, director, and spiritual leader of the Am Kollel Jewish Renewal Community of Greater Washington, and he is also the Rabbi Emeritus of Kehillah Kadasha, which is a Montgomery County-based Havarah. He is the past president of OHALA, the Rabbinic Association of Jewish Renewal Rabbis, and he's an accomplished musician and musical composer. On any given Shabbat service, you're probably, in this city at least, you'll probably hear his version of Shalom Aleichem all over the city. Rabbi David helped found Jews United for Justice, and he is active in various social justice organizations and really one of the go-to activists working on Middle East peace issues and other social justice issues in the Washington area. So Rabbi David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You need to give me a copy of that introduction. That would be great. I'd like to just share a few words about my earlier story. I grew up on a poultry farm in New Jersey, near a town called Lakewood, which had one of the largest yeshivas in the world based there at the time, still is. Many of the yeshiva, and a yeshiva is kind of like a Jewish monastery, by the way. You mentioned monastery before. It's kind of like a monastery for Jews. Anyway, but many refugees from Europe, because of the Holocaust, found their way to Lakewood, and where those students were able to continue to study. There was also a Reform temple, in town. And my parents, who were more culturally Jewish, my father actually was very devout, but he was a devout atheist. My mother more from a more cultural background, but very rooted, in Jewish traditions. They founded a conservative synagogue in Lakewood. There was none at the time. So I was exposed to all these three branches. Those are the major branches of Judaism, and there are other branches. Renewal, there's the Reconstructionist movement, there's a Jewish Humanist movement. And I'm starting out by saying that because, in this conversation that we're having today, just to understand that there are, as there are in other traditions, spiritual traditions, faith traditions, there are denominations, branches, movements. My grandparents, I just like to honor them and just say they were very involved in the Jewish workers movement, and some of the values that I have come from that tradition of fighting for workers' rights and just against injustice in general. Growing up, I loved the sense of community and the services, the religious services and the learning. Certain core values came through mainly through the holidays, I would say. Holiday celebrations, especially Hanukkah and Passover, celebrations of freedom. Also in the family, just a love for family and a love for learning. These were so instilled within me from a very young age. But in high school, I was drawn to other teachers and presentations of Judaism and Jewish values, more universal teachings. I had been exposed mostly to the more, I guess, particularistic traditions in the culture. But these universal teachings and concerns of Judaism, thinkers such as Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Buber deeply influenced me. Raise your hands if you've heard of Heschel and Buber. Raise your hands. Okay, great. Um, so in the Torah, which is our most sacred text, um, we see these parallel paths, sometimes competing paths of universalism and particularism. In our sacred text, the Torah, from Genesis, the creation story, and the emergence of humanity, and also the universal covenant, after the flood, the rainbow covenant, we see, this emphasis on universalism. Later in Exodus, we learn of a more particular covenant, a more unique path, where a particular people is then in a special relationship with God or with the divine. So we have, these two paths, and sometimes they do conflict with each other or, run into each other, but they are parallel. And I find that I'm fine with both. I am so happy that there's the universal path, and we have two philosophers in Judaism who also represent, these. Well, there are more than two, but in the Middle Ages we have Maimonides, who is more of the universalist school, and then Yehuda Halevi, also of Spain, from the more, particularistic school. Sometimes we'll call it maybe a more chauvinistic, I guess, kind of presentation or understanding. In Judaism, we have the written Torah, as many of you know, but we also have the oral Torah. And the definition of Judaism that I've come to really appreciate comes from Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, formerly an Orthodox Jew, is that Judaism is the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. Evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. And we've evolved because of the oral Torah. And the written Torah in Judaism and the oral Torah are considered by our rabbinic tradition equal. Okay, and that tradition continues. And Rabbi Gela later will help us understand just how that tradition is presenting itself today. So in the Torah, in the universal tradition, which in many of our faith traditions we really do share, in the first chapter in Genesis, and this is verse 27, if you want to follow along, if you have a Bible nearby. So it says, so God created Adam, which means a human, in God's own image. In the image of God, they were created, the first human, male and female, God created them. So each human being, what I take from this, each human being is a representative of the Creator, within the creation, and each in her own unique way. The Jewish sages have taught anyone who takes a single life, it is as though he has destroyed the entire world, and anyone who saves a single life, it is as though he has saved the entire world. Now, I know this is also a quote I've heard from my Muslim brothers and sisters from the Quran. So
same verse.
I'm sorry.
It is the same verse.
The same verse.
Yes.
Okay, so that's beautiful, and also from the Torah, I have been and continue to be drawn to the Torah because of the Torah lessons about human dignity. I mean, there are verses here and there you begin to wonder, but at its heart, is a deep concern for human dignity, that all people are deserving of being treated with dignity. In Leviticus, this comes across very strongly, and this is in other traditions as well. Love your neighbor, as yourself. If a city is under siege and its enemy declares, give us one of yours and we will leave you alone, what is the right thing to do? Well, our sages taught that we are not permitted to hand over an innocent life, even to save many more lives, because the Torah does not permit us to take an innocent life, even for the benefit of many. In our tradition, there we can organize our relationship in life with three levels. There's what's called Adam Lamakom, between an individual, a person, a human, and Hamakom, which means God. Ben Adam L'Chavero, between a person and another individual, another person, Ben Adam L'Atzmo, and between a person and oneself, So these three levels of relationship, of concern. So in the Torah and in our tradition, we have ways, practices, where we can manifest, live out, those relationships. So we find, Ben Adam L'Makom. This is where we do rituals and prayers, and we call the prayers like Avodat Halev, the service of the heart. So that's essential. Ben Adam L'Chavero, between ourselves and other human beings, and it doesn't distinguish between Jewish and others. Others. We have all these amazing teachings about social justice, how we treat the stranger. The mitzvah that's mentioned most, mitzvah means a right action. It's also translated as commandment. That's mentioned most in the Torah, some 36 times, is to be welcoming to the stranger. Another major teaching several times in the Torah, to take care of those who are in need, the orphan, the widow, those who are less fortunate. We learn from Leviticus 19, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Do not put a stumbling block before the blind. Pay your workers on time. Be impartial in judgment, and so on. It's really worth taking a look at Leviticus 9, verses 1 through 18. So that's Ben Adam L'Chavero, between a person and another human being. But I want to expand on that a little bit, because it's not only about, there's also social justice in the Torah, but so much about eco-justice, environmental ethics. We are, from the second chapter of Genesis, Adam is to be a shomer, a guardian of the earth, a guardian of the earth. So we have these really important teachings about our relationship to the earth, which has become much more prominent, in recent years. And in Judaism today, maybe Gila will talk about this a little later, but we see the emergence of Jewish environmental organizations. There's several now. So we have here, we're stewards of the earth. The Shabbat itself is a day of when we are in harmony with the earth. We don't plow, we don't plant, we don't cut things, we don't do any of that. We're supposed to be in harmony with the earth, not even pulling a flower or a blade of grass. That's kind of to be in harmony with nature. And then every seventh year, last year was a seventh year. In the Torah it says, let the land lie fallow, eat what grows naturally. And there, there are more teachings surrounding that, but what an incredibly radical concept. There are these radical environmental concepts that come right from, our scriptures, the Torah and the Hebrew Bible. Back to the Adam L'Atzmo, how we, we're also called upon to take care of ourselves. And how do we do that? Through learning, through personal growth, through being in community, through celebration, through song. All this, is also integral to Judaism. Wrestling with God, is a very important part of that concept. We're invited to wrestle with God. We see examples of this, or to even argue with God. In last week's portion in the Torah, Abraham is arguing with God. God wants to destroy, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, for their wickedness, whatever. And what was their main sin? They weren't welcoming to the stranger, to those who need, And Abraham, he's bothered by this. How can you destroy this entire city? What if there are 50 righteous people? What if, and he couldn't find 50. What if there are 40? Well, he couldn't find 40. And they worked their way all the way down to 10, and it just was like, but the idea that he is wrestling with God, he has this conversation, more than a conversation, he's actually bargaining with God. How many of us have ever bargained with God? And then later on in the Torah, in the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, and the name Yisrael, Israel, means one who wrestles with God and with others, with humans. So just to give you an idea, Moses was a great wrestler. And he also would stand up to God every so often if he wasn't happy with how God was getting so angry with the people. There, around the golden calf story, you'll find examples of that. So another, major value, core value teaching in Judaism comes from the prophetic tradition and from the Torah, and then expanded upon by the Hebrew prophets. Social justice. In the book of Deuteronomy, we know tzedek tzedek tirdov, justice, justice you shall pursue. It's emphasized, throughout the Torah. Tzedek umishpat ashira, chesed umishpat ashira from the Psalms, all throughout the Psalms. Justice is emphasized, and the righteousness of people is honored, is emphasized. So that deeply influenced me as I was growing up, especially in college during the anti-Vietnam War days. And I started on campus. I started an organization, a Jewish Fellowship for Action, because the local Hillel organization didn't want to get involved in politics. You see, so I created another student organization. Students from Rutgers and also Douglas. Anyone go to Rutgers? Anyone go to Douglas here? And we created this organization. We organized protests on campus, and we also went into the synagogues in the Raritan Valley, New Jersey area, and we spoke. We spoke from this voice of the Hebrew prophets, from our Torah, against the war in Vietnam and what that represented. Moving on, I know the time is very short. We're taught by the prophets also to be a light unto the nations, or lagoyim, to be an example. The land of Israel, we have this incredible connection historically to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, to its sacredness and all that it represents in the history and the growth of our people. And we also note, I certainly note maybe more seriously than some of my brothers and sisters from maybe other movements in Judaism, Genesis 12, where it talks about how the land is promised to Abraham's descendants. Well, Abraham's descendants include the children of Isaac and the children of Ishmael. You see, so that's a very so that really means something to me and the work that I do. Tikkun olam, you've probably heard the term, means to repair the world. And this also is an important value concept in Judaism that has taken even more prominence in Jewish life over the years, especially the past, I would say, 40 years, when it became an even more popular term. To seek peace and pursue it, teachings from the Psalms, and from the Talmud of love and justice I will sing, to envision and work towards a messianic age. These are important teachings. We see the words of the prophets, Isaiah and Micah, on the UN building, and some of you, maybe all of you know this already, where it says, you shall beat your swords into plowshares, your spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not live with sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So these are the values, the core values of Judaism, and they're manifest, different levels with different intensity in different movements. Sadly, it's, there are differences, of opinion, and people sometimes draw on the same teachings, as you might know from your own traditions, and find, a different way, see a different way of understanding. So I'm going to hold it there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Okay, so let me introduce our next speaker, Rabbi Gila. Thank you very much, Rabbi David. We'll be hearing from you more very soon. Rabbi Gila Langner is the rabbi at Kol Ami, the Northern Virginia Reconstructionist community in Arlington, if I'm not mistaken. She has previously served as the rabbi of Sharat HaNefesh in Chevy Chase. She was the principal of Shorashim Hebrew School and Kehillah Kadasha Hebrew School. We heard now Kehillah Kadasha mentioned twice. She has been a visiting chaplain or an adjunct professor at various area universities, and she is the founding publisher and co-editor of a journal called Harem Creative Explorations in Judaism. What a fascinating title. So Rabbi Gila, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you everybody for taking time on this Sunday afternoon, cold and delicious Sunday afternoon to be together. So, Rabbi David's summary is just fabulous of the high and lofty goals that and values that Judaism has had and continues to have. Of course, our record of compliance is a whole lot lower, um, as you would expect with human beings anywhere, right? All you have to do is look at the end of the book of Exodus, as David alluded to with the golden calf story, or most of the entire book of Numbers in the Torah. So even when the Israelites had just witnessed, they had just been freed from Egypt and this mighty crossing of the sea, according to the tale, and they had just witnessed God's presence on Mount Sinai. 40 days later, they're busy building a golden calf. Ouch. Kind of a real letdown, right? And then story after story in the book of Numbers about challenges to authority and about grumbling over the conditions in the desert. So we have a full record of just how hard it is to live on a spiritual high plane. And I think it's a very profound tradition that invites us to look at it with open eyes and to discuss it every year as we read the same stories over and over again. We don't shy away from witnessing and trying to explore and understand our backsliding in the desert and in current life. So we are fully human. We, like every people, we sometimes try and fail to live up to our best values, and sometimes it seems like some of us aren't even trying at all. So um, we've never really thought, when you think about um, the rabbis tried to encapsulate all of the laws and traditions and teachings and values of Judaism into a pithy soundbite. And so the one I think that won out, well, it was in the top three contenders, was from the prophet Micah in the book of Micah, who said, "What do you know, human being? What is asked of you? Only to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God." So we've never thought of that as asking too much of us, it's not a cudgel to beat ourselves up with, but it's aspirations on an ongoing basis. But I would say today, in both Israel and America, where the two largest concentrations of Jews live, Jewish values are bumping up against realities we haven't really encountered before. Certainly in Israel, it's been 2,000 years since we've had a polity, and even then, we were not autonomous in our own land. And so you have to go back even further to find a time when Jews were actually governing their people in their own land. And so it is an unprecedented situation where in Israel you have people traumatized by hundreds of years of living in a sort of an abnormal situation, and then of course the Holocaust, dealing with power and autonomy and strength for the first time in thousands of years, and it is definitely a challenge. I'm not going to spend time on that. I think this group is probably very familiar with the situations and the achievements and the difficulties and the uh, really severe problems going on in Israel. So I'm going to leave that be right now. But I want to talk a little bit more about America because that's also a different situation than Jews have ever encountered. It is a different diaspora situation. I think you'd have to go back to the golden age of Spain to find a time when Jews lived with Christians and Muslims in harmony. But even then, even in Spain, Jews were not really equal in the way that we understand that now in America or since the Enlightenment, as having individual equal rights in the civic sphere. That was not even the case back then. And so we are in a very different situation than we've ever been. Um, I listened to Rabbi Yehuda Kurtzer last week, who said that for Jews in America, um, the great project of the 20th century, since most of the Jews who arrived in America, they came between 1880 and 1920, and their great project was to achieve assimilation into America, which I laugh at because, of course, rabbis are not really keen on Jews assimilating away into the broader society. Rabbis hope that Jews will keep hold of our values and traditions and customs. But in many ways, assimilation really was the project. And it was for Jews who arrived here primarily from Russia and lands adjacent to Russia, from Eastern Europe. Um, Becoming part of a more universalist society, achieving economic comfort and wealth was a dream come true, right? After centuries of being second, third class citizens, of living in abject poverty. They were keen to change their economic circumstances, and so I think that you saw a lot of, over time, as Jews succeeded in America, you saw an emphasis on materialism, perhaps an emphasis on excess consumerism and status consciousness, that were the response, the adjustments of Jews to this totally newfound freedom of economic opportunity. If you recall, Jews in Russia in the Pale of Settlement had very few opportunities open to them. They could not really own land, right? Jews have always been in Europe, have been prevented from owning land. And so they were limited to a very few occupations. And coming to America unleashed a tremendous pent-up desire to be a part of the of the economy, and to achieve um, economic security. Um, I think some of that, and some of that we saw in the excesses of, uh, just to give some examples, the excesses of bar and bat mitzvah ceremonies in America, right? That became a kind of, the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah is the coming of age ceremony for a boy or girl at age 12 or 13. And we saw this especially in the 80s and 90s, I think, really excessive displays of wealth and just going totally overboard on parties for a young teenager. Uh, and they were really demonstrations, I think, of the parents' desire to be seen as being having arrived, right? I think the rabbis and the Jewish community pushed back on that, and relatively successfully. I wouldn't say that there still are not some of these bar bat mitzvah parties that have gone overboard, but it's much less so, much less the case these days. So I think there has been a kind of a peaking of that status consciousness in those ways. Um, Perhaps, Dan, you might disagree, and you still find some of that. I'm not invited to the best party, so I don't know. But I think that some of that excess has been curbed. But I'd like to also say that America and the experience of America has reshaped Jewish values. And there's been a really interesting kind of synchronicity of Jewish values uh, in this time in America, because of course America has been undergoing tremendous change in the last 50 years as well. As much as some folks would like to roll that clock backward, we've witnessed in our own lifetimes, for many of us, tremendous changes in the situation of, for example, women in society, and that sparked back and forth with Jewish society as well, as Jews in the non-Orthodox parts of Judaism achieved gender equality in Judaism. So we had the first bat mitzvah, the first coming of age for a Jewish um, uh, teenager back in 1922, I believe. I think this was the 100th year of the first bat mitzvah. But it never really was much of a ceremony or a practice until in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It began, and now it's completely taken for granted that Jewish girls will have a bat mitzvah just as Jewish boys have a bar mitzvah, and we have the rise of female rabbis and Jewish women in all parts of the Jewish world, in the public world. And so I think you see that what we would say is a Jewish value of equality that we on the progressive side of Judaism read from Genesis 1 that to male and female God created the first humans in the image of God. But we would say that now finally we are seeing that come true, and that's been an enormous positive value. Pluralism is a great Jewish and American value, and I think America has been wonderful for us that way, where we are able to have, as Rabbi David mentioned, all kinds of denominations across the spectrum, and that fits in America very comfortably. And also to echo Rabbi David's words, there's been an incredible emphasis on tikkun olam, on repairing the world as a Jewish value. That was primarily championed by the Reform movement in America, but it has become a central element, I would say, of all of the non-Orthodox movements in Judaism. Fixing the world in all different kinds of ways has become a paramount value. And some of our practices have evolved here in America. So I want to take one specific little practice and just open that up a little bit for everyone. So you can kind of get a sense of how things shift back and forth. So the custom I want to look at is this custom of sitting Shiva. Now, Jews have a very elaborate set of traditions around death, of what is done afterwards in the mourning process after a person's death. Sitting Shiva is the ritual, the main ritual practice that meant for 7 days. Shiva means 7. So for 7 days following the death of a loved one, those who are in mourning, the family around of the deceased, would be completely taken care of. They would be sitting Shiva, and the community would take care of them. The community would make food for them. The community would come to the house of mourning to hold the daily services so that they could stay put and did not have to venture out. And so there is even rules about how you shouldn't engage the person who is mourning in conversation. You just sit there and let them talk on what's on their mind, right? Not to distract them from their grief, and not to substitute your own thoughts and feelings for theirs, but to truly be there in empathy and sympathy, and in support. And the whole idea was to give honor, comfort to the mourners, but also, very importantly, give honor to the dead. So that even if a person dies without family, the Jewish custom was that the 10 people in the community would come and sit Shiva for that person who had died. And there was sort of not only was the mourner helped through this time, but the community was, in a sense, reshaped, uh, reconfigured after this loss. And everybody would hopefully slowly return to normal after this 7-day period. But in America, many pieces of these rituals have been turned upside down. So instead of people taking care of the mourners land up feeling that they need to order a big platter to take care of all the people who come to visit them, because they sort of interpret it as that they are in a sense, bizarrely entertaining, right? They have all these people coming to their home, so they've got to feed them. Right? That was never, ever remotely the thought in the past. And so, what happens when people start eating and talking is it becomes almost like a party, and that is also absolutely uh, anathema to the tradition, right? I'm not saying it's a terrible thing, but it's just exactly opposite of the atmosphere that the House of Shiva normally used to have. And instead of taking a week out of one's life for this kind of intensive mourning to really go through this experience, people would now whittle down the 7 days to 3 days, which is interesting. That's similar to Muslim tradition because it's a long time to go a whole week, especially if you feel like you have to entertain people during that week. And now people have whittled that down even just to 1 day, or even just a lunch after the funeral, as if that's really the essence of sitting Shiva. It's not, right? Or people feel they have to get back to work, or they just don't want to do anything all day long. And the community doesn't show up until the evening when everybody comes at once. Traditionally, people would come in ones and twos and threes and just sit during the day and have conversation, have reminiscences about the person who died. So the whole value of setting aside time and setting up rules to allow for absorbing the loss and mourning the loss has kind of been subverted. As has the tradition of honoring the dead with this time period. Some mourners say, well, I don't need to sit Shiva, as if the only reason for sitting Shiva is for their own comfort. That was only one of the values. The other was to honor the weight of the loss of the deceased. Now, interestingly, another change has happened. It's just in the last 2 years, and with this, I'm going to close. Um, with Zoom, because people couldn't come during the pandemic, could not show up in person, or didn't feel comfortable eating at people's houses. So we have the advent of the Zoom Shiva Minyan. And so people gather on Zoom. And instead of just having chit chat around a table, you actually have the old custom of speaking about the person who died and sharing memories, and people in the crowd on Zoom able to share memories as well. And in some ways, it is a return to the traditional custom of what Shiva was like and how it felt. And so I think it's quite fascinating to see how we are once again put back into the values that we originated with. So let me stop there and turn things back to you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rabbi Gila. I want to share something, if I can, on the screen. You all see it? Can you all see what I'm looking at? 3 questions.
Yes.
Okay. So these are questions that I'd like us to be considering for the rest of the session. Probably best to have the personal perspectives or stories shared in small groups. But you've heard a lot about core Jewish values. You may have other suggestions. You've also heard something about challenges that we face. If you can speak candidly about those, what we can do to meet these challenges, how we've done to meet these challenges, that would be great too. I have some other specific questions that we could add to these, but I think right now I'd just like to hear some other voices, and you can ask questions to the panelists or just make a statement.
Dan,
Go ahead, Mike.
it is very fascinating to hear both the rabbis. And as I have mentioned, for many years, I've been working with the Jewish friends, all religions, in fact. There are so many similarities. And I was about to say, when she said 7 days about Shiva, and when Rabbi Gila said that, I immediately said 3 days in the Muslim traditions, and it is very similar that people bring food. But now we're doing the Zoom Shivas even in Islam. The question I had for a rabbi, both the rabbis, Rabbi Schneier, what is the significance of 10 and what is the significance of 7 for Rabbi Gila?
So thank you, Mike. You said the first question is, what is the significance of what?
Number 10,
Of,
the
of,
minion,
of the
the
number
number,
10?
yeah.
Oh boy, it has lots in our tradition, a lot of significance. I mean, what comes immediately to mind are the Aseret Hadibrot, the 10 statements, the 10 commandments, as it's known more popularly, but literally means more like the 10 statements, the 10 principles. So these, according to one of the narratives in our Torah, this is what was given to Moses, at Sinai. This is the revelation. So it represents that. The number 10, in fact, it's an interesting thing because we have, 10 fingers, you know what I mean? And when I was, I have to just, share this with you. When I was at my son's yeshiva in his yeshiva is located actually in a settlement of 64,000 people, actually, in the West Bank. When I was at the yeshiva last year, the students there wanted to shake my hand, but my wife and I were the only ones who were masked, and she was sitting upstairs with the other women. I was downstairs. I was the only man that was masked, and then they wanted to shake my hand to congratulate me on, upon my son's wedding, but I wouldn't shake hands because I still don't shake hands because hands go to mouth to nose, whatever. So I did this. I did the elbow. I said they used the word shnei luchot, the 2 tablets of the Torah. I did this and then I did this, So each arm representing a tablet because Moses held the tablets, the luchot they're called, luchos or luchot, held them up. So it got the whole yeshiva doing this. And when I left, the head of the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva, when he said goodbye to me, he also said, Shnei luchos. So it's a new tradition, and in a couple of years we'll think it's 1,000 years old. But the number 10, I know there's other significance in the meaning, but that's what jumps out immediately.
Well,
Gila, do you have any other?
right. Well, so you might be also wondering why we call it a minion of 10 people. If you want to say anything about that, David.
Yeah. In fact, this is from last week's Torah reading, because when Abraham was bargaining with God over the destruction of the city, when to destroy the city, it boiled down to 10, and it stops there. He could have said, well, what if there are 5 righteous people? What if there is 1 righteous person? But it stopped at 10. So as I learned a while back, well, that's where we get the idea that a community, has to be that number 10, minimally the number 10 for a community. And of course, in most of the Jewish tradition over the years, it was specifically meant to refer to 10 men. Now, in the non-Orthodox world, it's 10 men and women. So that's thank you, Gila, for reminding me of that sitting events there too.
Rabbi Schneier, also, I understand that 10 is reduced to 1. 1 plus 0 in numerology is 1, and it means unity also. So I think it has a very deep significance.
It means, yeah, it's true. I mean, it's the first letter in the Yud Kei Vav Kei, the first letter of the name of God. Okay, the ineffable name of God in our tradition. Yud, the letter Yud, which is numeric value of 10, according to I believe in the Kabbalah, is the beginning point, the point of the universe. That everything started from that point because it's the smallest letter, and everything started from that smallest letter, the Yud, which is the integral of 10. Yeah.
Mike, you had a question about the number 7?
Yes.
Seven is
Gila?
deeper.
Yes. So seven is also one of those magical numbers in Judaism. 7 days of creation, especially, and the seventh day is the Sabbath. So seven has a sense of kind of completion, of fullness, and so it's used in other things as well. For Shiva, you could sort of see why a full week would be part of that custom,
Seven branch candelabrum.
right?
The
Mhm.
seven, emphasis on the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears. So there, all these layers of meaning. The seven matriarchs and patriarchs. We wrap the phylacteries, the tefillin, around our arms 7 times, for the meaning of eternality, but also to represent the patriarchs and the matriarchs.
I think in
Laura.
Kabbalah also, it's 7 endocrine glands too.
Yeah, true. And the seven lower sphirot in the Kabbalah system, which is 10. There are 10 emanations of divine energy in the Kabbalah, like the chakras, the chakra system. So we have these 10 emanations of the divine, and the lower 7 are the ones that we are much more connected to, mind, body, and spirit. The upper.
It's amazing that number 7 in Islamic tradition, when they go to the Mecca, the Kaaba, the cube, Muslims are supposed to go 7 circles around that. And in Hindu tradition, when they take vows, the bride and the groom walk around the fire 7 times. It's amazing with that number 7.
We have that same thing in Judaism with the bride circles the groom 7 times. And on one of our holidays, when we celebrate the Torah, we do 7 circles as well. So very interesting how
Yeah.
those circling that 7 times. Beautiful. Yeah.
So Laura, you're muted, but you're next.
Okay, so yeah. So I'm going back to your first question. Something about what are some basic Jewish values? Was that the question?
Core values, right?
Core value. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind is life. And I mean, when it comes to all of the laws and prohibitions about what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, if it comes to saving a life, you can break any of those laws to save a life. L'chaim, to life. And when it comes to moral issues, though, I was doing this with my students this past week. We were talking about morality in different religions, and we were looking at a Gallup survey of Americans and different moral issues, and 2 of them have always stood out to me. Is abortion morally acceptable or morally wrong? Is the death penalty morally acceptable or morally wrong? And the curious thing is, I guess the more conservative folks tend to say abortion is wrong, but death penalty is okay, which seems to me like a contradiction. And then there was another pair of statements. Is suicide morally acceptable or morally wrong? And what about doctor-assisted suicide? Those were separated. And again, there's more tendency to say suicide is wrong, but doctor-assisted suicide is okay, which doesn't make sense to me because I think of doctor-assisted suicide as a subset of suicide. But I do wonder if by doctor-assisted, people may have interpreted that as euthanasia, but I think those are 2 different things.
Well, I'll let the panel respond, but it's just thing that comes to my mind to hear your question or your statement is that there can be multiple core values and they can rub up against each other. So somebody could say, well, I have a core value in favor of X, whether it's life or liberty or whatever, but I have another core value in favor of Y, which is why I may appear to be inconsistent when in fact, in one instance, I'm applying primarily one core value, and in another instance, I'm applying primarily a separate core value. Anyway, if one of the rabbis want to respond to Laura. David, you're muted. I think you're both muted, actually.
Thanks. Do you have would you like to address one of her questions? They're excellent questions. And,
Excellent questions, and I think Dan really gave a very wise response, right? That there are multiple core values, and we all tend to interpret them in different ways. But go ahead, David.
on the question of the death penalty, it's there in the Torah, but the rabbinic tradition is very, very clear that it was so rare. It was so rare that it was meted out. There's one reference that if it happened once in 70 years, that was amazing, because it required such a level of corroboration by witnesses, and there was so much that made it virtually impossible. That's why there was such a turmoil in the state of Israel over the Eichmann trial. Some of you might recall that. And it was the only time in Israel's now 75, almost 75 years since the state was declared, that it's the only time there was the death penalty was used. So it's really extremely rare. It's frowned upon. It's rare. As far as abortion, again, you'll find a spectrum of teaching, of responses within the movements in Judaism. One thing that is clear is that the fetus, the embryo fetus, is not considered a full human. So the mother's life always takes precedence. You say the mother's life takes precedence. So that is clear in cross the line. And depending on, and I would suggest taking a moment to Google the different responses from the different movements, because they do vary. But abortion, is call it a right and sometimes a necessity. If it's absolutely clear that for all the reasons that we've been struggling and fighting over the past couple of years, since how long has it been since Roe Wade, kind of was put down by the Supreme Court? You can see just how it's complex. But within Judaism, there is an important acknowledgement that under certain situations, it is absolutely necessary.
Rabbi David, I think your statement, how long has it been, is kind of a funny one, because it hasn't been that long, except if you count the leak. It was leaked before the opinion came out.
Yeah.
And yes, and we've heard about other leaks this week. So that's not something many of us are used to. Before Nora's question, I want to point out that the first question that Laura addressed it. What do you understand to be the core Jewish values? Part A is of the faith, but part B is of the folk over the past century. We've talked a lot about the core values of Judaism as a faith, but Rabbi Gila also touched on, to some degree, the folk. And I think that's something that we should strongly consider, that Judaism, I think Rabbi David used the definition from Mordecai Kaplan, an evolving religious civilization. Well, that brings into account not just the faith, but also the folk, the people. So that's something we shouldn't forget. But anyway, Nora, you're next.
I just put my question into the chat for everybody to see. I just put my question into the chat.
Well, let me see if I can find it, and then I'll read it out loud.
Read it for you. My observation, the core values remains very similar in all monotheistic religion. That's my observation.
Okay.
In Judaism, how the importance of the core values shifted among various denomination within the Jewish, and what was the reason of that shift?
I'm not sure if I heard.
I said that in of all the religion, the importance of we have a same set of core values, but certain group puts a lot more emphasis on certain core values than others. It becomes a priority stack. Something comes first, second, third. So I want to understand how various groups within the Jewish community views those, so that I have a better appreciation about certain things, so that I want to have a better appreciation.
Okay, thank you, thank you. It, all I can say is that we are shutaf lamase reshi. We are partners, with the Creator, with God in life. We are of God. We and what I mean is that we choose. We can also choose how we wish to manifest, to live, those teachings. For some of us, there are certain teachings that are just resonate much more deeply. There are those Jews who, the ritual practice of Judaism, Ben Adam L'Makon, is more important in their lives. Praying 3 times a day, being strictly kosher, the rituals, um, are more meaningful than how we relate to our fellow human beings. Not that it's not important, but it's, because it is important, but it's not, it doesn't have the same emphasis in certain parts of the Jewish community. So I choose to, my own life in partnership with God, to do more in the realm of social justice. You see, it doesn't make one right or wrong. Everyone has to kind of find the right balance for themselves ultimately, and this is part of what it means to us to be in dialogue, with the divine and with ourselves and with humanity. It's the wrestling concept of wrestling with God.
So if I can add to that, um, I think you're right. I would say core values across almost all religions are very similar, and I think that goes to the idea that the religions are trying to create a world, a society that functions well and that is able to sustain itself, and gives people something to hold on to. But I would say that the same kind of dynamic happens in Judaism as in some other religions as well, where there's a tension between maintaining the community and being part of a larger consciousness of the world. And so I would say that I think of it in terms of those who are guardians of the tradition and those who have that prophetic sensibility that Rabbi David was talking about, and that we've always had prophets and guardians, right? And we have that in so many different ways. Some folks are really concerned with maintaining the tradition, the practices, the customs, and the rituals, and the liturgy, and all of the wealth of civilization that has come down to us, and passing that on to their children and generations in the future. And some are really concerned about looking around the world and trying to make it better and trying to improve it and fix what's wrong, right? And so there's that dual focus. I think both are important, but different groups in Judaism will have a different perspective, right? So Reform Jews will be much more oriented towards repairing the world and much less interested in the rituals and customs. Um, and the opposite would be among the Orthodox, right, who are very much concerned with maintaining and preserving and passing down the traditions and are less involved in the larger world, the non-Jewish world. Does that help?
So, Nora, if I can address something you said before, Andra, who was next, and maybe talking a little bit, we often encounter that our blank is thing. When we first encountered it, was believe in the same God. Right? And our core values are the same. There's a core truth, both of those statements, but also, if you will, a core falsity. The core truth in terms of our values being the same has to be, right, that if you're talking about what's really important to us, whether or love, it's kind of hard to argue that these are not core values. Sorry if I'm not doing a good job of shutting down some, hold on a second. I hear a loud noise. Okay. So our core values are very similar.
Sounds like a stampede of horses.
Yeah, it's somebody's unmuted and probably left the room. Our core values are very similar, but then we get into maybe, you know, values that are important to us that are sort of second level. So you heard the one today mentioned twice, wrestling with God. I'm not sure I've heard Muslims talk about themselves as God wrestlers, as opposed to people who submit, right?
Right, Rand, and I agree fully with that.
We hear the term from our Christian brothers and sisters, the meek shall inherit the earth, which is like a different translation from scripture than I think the Jewish translation. We often hear about the value of chutzpah, which is associated with the folk, but I think it becomes a very important value that Jewish people teach their children. Don't be a lemech, was the way my parents used to say it. Don't let people kick you around. These are values where the rubber meets the road. Now, you may not call them core. A similar point on the theological issue. The very first JIDS meeting was at a home back in the beginning of 2009, and the topic was God. And I think the expectation could have been, we could have listened to, you know, two speakers talk about what we call the strict monotheism of Judaism and Islam. But instead, people were sharing largely their own views with respect to God. And I thought for a minute, I was like having an out-of-body experience. I thought, I say, well, wait a minute. How come a bazillion percentage of these Jews are atheist? And how come a bazillion percentage of these Muslims are fundamentalist? Like, this is like polar opposites. And yet we're supposed to be the closest to each other theologically. So this is an example of how it's one thing to talk about our faiths in theory, and it's another thing to talk about the way the folk, the way the civilization has evolved when the rubber meets the road. So I say this as the non-member of the clergy here, who maybe observes some other things than the clergy might. But Andra, your hand is up and you are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. This has really been very interesting because we're really opening up the Torah and for a lot of discussion and hearing. I love the concept of the guardians versus those that are prophetic. Humans progress. Humans progress in consciousness. And when we progress in consciousness, we look at life differently. And so that's the reason why I appreciate when Judaism changes. It holds the same basic values: love, kindness, compassion, thoughtfulness, caring about others, but it shows up differently as we're here in 2022. I know that Dan will probably be in alignment with me with this in terms of sacrifice and the sacrifice of animals. That was needed at a certain point in time for human beings, perhaps long ago, who were riddled with guilt and felt that, you know, sacrificing an animal, you know, assuaged their guilt, or whatever was done in the Torah at one time. And Gila, I'm not familiar with everything that's in Leviticus, but I believe that they do say references for sacrifice are in Leviticus, and that there are some people who are the guardians, so to speak, who are waiting for the temple to be built again to continue with the sacrifice of animals. But one of the things, Mike, I'm going to reel you into this, that he mentioned, because there's a particular holiday in Islam called Eid el-Adha, where animals are sacrificed, to remember that time when Abraham was asked to kill his son and sacrifice his son. And Mike actually made a video. Do you remember, Mike, with the concept of maybe we progress to the point that do we really need to kill animals, or is it more important to sacrifice our ego? So there are different ways of looking at this and looking at the concept of sacrifice. And so we've progressed. I know that when we talk about the death penalty, for some reason, my mind, as you saw in chat, goes back to stoning, and I don't know at that time whether they really had lots of witnesses and people coming forward to say this, they saw this or they saw that. I know that women were stoned, supposedly for adultery. I don't know whether that, I don't know what the concept was. Laura brought up that wasn't necessarily adultery, but did they know that when they stoned women? For what? Why was stoning done? And what would be the reason and the justification for that? And maybe that type of justification wouldn't settle well today, knowing how people are and human beings are today in today's world. So we've progressed, I think, as a humanity. And I guess sometimes we have to look back on what our core values are at the deepest level, but see how we are to navigate life now using those core values, but maybe questioning, as you mentioned, Dan, Judaism does question, how we will view those core values and how we will uphold them in today's world. I don't know how Rabbi David or Rabbi Gila will respond to that, but I would appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Andra, thank you so much. These are huge questions, and you've raised really interesting things. I somewhat I shy away from that notion that we've come a long way whenever that's applied to our ancient history. The number of animals that are slaughtered in the most horrific conditions, raised in horrific conditions and slaughtered, it so far vastly swamps any kind of sacrificial system in the past, which was intended to allow you to eat meat, to allow you to have animal food, but sanctifying it, right? Recognizing that you've taken a life, and sanctifying that life. And so it was a whole different idea than when we go into a supermarket and see the shelves full of body parts that that modern society has. I mean, our notion of what's acceptable vis-a-vis the animal world is just, oh my gosh. Okay, don't get me started on that. On the death penalty, there was stoning in the Torah, and women were adulterous if they were married and had sexual relations outside the marriage. They were considered adulterous, as was a man who had sexual relations with a married woman. So there was stoning for that. Um, it's a horrific way to carry out the death penalty, but I think most of us agree that death penalties are outside the pale of what should be allowed. But we live in a society that still has death penalties. Go to Death Penalty Action on the internet to raise your voice against the actually cruel way in which death penalties are carried out in different states still, and on a constant basis. The rabbis, as David mentioned, the rabbi, at Texas, Oklahoma, there's still quite a few states the rabbis softened this. So a court, the Sanhedrin, that allowed for a single execution was called the killing court. And so it was that, that rare and that unusual. They made it almost impossible to have a death penalty implemented. So there was a real softening from the situation in the Torah.
Thank you,
If I,
Gary.
if I can ask one of our panelists, in any of the Jewish movements today, is there discussions by the board or, votes or whatever about going vegetarian, completely? Does that come up? I mean, I've heard the term eco-kosher, but that could just be some individual's term for it. But I think it's safe to say that we no longer live in a society where we need to eat meat in order to get our basic nutrients. I don't know if I'm an example in terms of health. I'm not. I mean, I've got a doctor's appointment tomorrow, but I've been a vegan for 30 years. So, I'm not dead yet. But is that something that's coming up in rabbinical circles?
And there's also vegan rabbis. There are a large
Yeah.
grouping of vegan rabbis that actually refer back to the Torah, speaking about the concept of animals and eating animals, and were they really given to us to have dominion over them, or were they given to us to kill them and eat them?
So my question was more just not to be rhetorical, but just factually, is this something that is coming up in any of the movements in Judaism where there are actually votes about having the movement embrace vegetarianism? I won't even use the word veganism. Got to start baby steps.
Yeah. Just to comment, I don't know if there has been, specific conversations in any of the rabbinical movements about, you're saying in support of vegetarianism or veganism. I mean, it is, in the Torah, as as Andra mentioned in the first chapter, the diet of the human diet is to be vegetarian, fruitarian, eat of the vegetation and the fruits of the trees, and the kashrut, or the later on after the flood, there's an injunction to to eat flesh. I mean, a lot of this is rooted in the nature of an agrarian society, where people, had to do things that, probably were not the ideal in order to survive. In Judaism, the essence of kashrut has to do with kind of letting the blood, out of the animal in the slaughtering process, because the blood represents the soul. Let the blood return to the earth. And then also in the very strict ways in which animals are slaughtered. I mean, I've been to slaughtering houses, and close to 50 years ago, I stopped eating red meat altogether. But so there's a growing consciousness about that in the Jewish community. Rabbinic associations, they're not coming, and what we call halacha, the Jewish law committees, as far as I know, have not debated, issuing some kind of a takana, an enactment, on how the people should refrain from eating meat altogether. There's, in the kosher industry, there is a consciousness. People know that, caged chickens are not, part of our ethical way, our way of slaughtering chickens, and neither, injecting the animals with antibiotics and, and what else do they get? Gosh, I mean, it doesn't. That's different. It is different. What can I say? It should be discussed perhaps, but for an organization to, and there is a movement. There is a Jewish vegetarian movement, and we've also had Jewish vegetarians several times at our retreat center. And our retreat center is a vegetarian facility, but a vegetarian/dairy. But there are groups of Jews that have this rising consciousness. There's a I forget his name, but he's written tremendous amount of material, but there's a lot about this.
Richard Schwartz.
Richard, thank you. A lot about this. And we also sponsored a conference here in Washington about 20 years ago on Judaism and vegetarianism with Richard Schwartz as the keynote speaker. So there's a consciousness about it within the Jewish world. But as far as a rabbinic body coming down and making a takana in a law, as we've done with other kinds of things over time. I mean, in the Ashkenazic world in Judaism, I mean, polygamy was outruled, in the Middle Ages by Rabbi Gershon, from was it Germany or Austria? That was the Middle Ages, and there are other things, women's rights, for property rights in the Torah. There's a serious problem with women were not allowed to own property, in the Torah. Well, the daughters of Tzalafchad, a loyal follower of Moses, went to Moses. He died, and the daughters went to Moses to complain. This is not right. They said, this is not right that we can't inherit our father's property. So Moses excused himself. He had a conversation with God. God said to Moses, get it right, change the law. So that's one example of how, even within the context of the most sacred teachings, which, by the way, are sacred teachings, as many Jews see it, including some more traditional Jewish scholars over time, evolved. I mean, it didn't all happen at one moment. It took several hundred years before our Tanakh, our Hebrew Bible, was canonized. It took several hundred years, and people forget everything was given at Mount Sinai. That's not the case. And there are many authors. It's not. I know this is different in the way Muslims, as I understand, perceive the origin of the Quran. But for most Jews, including Orthodox Jews who study Talmud, they'll see how these texts that we have, there were successive generations that can continue that process. Gila, do you have any further comment on that?
So just a word about this. So I would say that the problem is for all the things that kashrut, Jewish kosher laws are not, can be criticized or are not where we would like them to be. The people who feel that way in the progressive world, non-Orthodox world, don't keep kosher, so it doesn't really matter to them enough to change those laws. And for the people who do keep kosher and are traditional, there is no real way to change those laws. There's no obvious way. There's no central authority, and there's no process that really is easy to get those laws changed.
So I thought maybe Nora, I appreciate your question about maybe addressing questions that I asked, but maybe we can do that after small groups. I want to give everybody an opportunity in a small group to maybe share some personal perspectives or personal stories that have shaped your idea of these values. And we don't have to spend more than 15 minutes doing it, but I think maybe we can, I'm going to pause the recording. We just heard that we had an all Muslim. Well, all the Muslims who were here were placed in the same group. I assure you that was not intentional.
That's what I mentioned.
Yeah.
I mentioned it was random.
Yeah, we were all
I mean-
Jews.
And Mara, you are now perpendicular to the rest of us. I don't know how that happened. Wow.
I don't know either.
It's always good to have it's good to have a different perspective. That's
Maybe-
called thinking outside the box. There you go.
Okay.
Oh, she fixed it. Good for you.
Yeah, I had kept it horizontal, my cell phone, and so now I changed it, placed it vertical. So
I wish we could share our perspectives so easily and change them that way. That's amazing, Humar.
Good point.
Is there a spokesperson from each group that we have? Didn't have that many
Dr.
groups that maybe you can share some ideas from what
Dr.
you
Ali is
heard?
Dr. Ali is our share person.
okay.
Okay, please.
Oh, you want me to go first? All right.
Yes, please.
We discussed regarding that issue about animal sacrifice, which one of the members had brought in. And we said that unanimously, all three of us were of the opinion that Rabbi Gila did a fantastic job of answering that. That commercially, a large number of animals are sacrificed, and that too in a very horrendous way, and all that, to eat the meat. And whereas our tradition of Eid al-Adha, in the footsteps of our beloved Prophet Ibrahim, or Abraham, that you say, we do it to eat the meat, and in the most sanctimonious way, as she has put it, in a very clean, good food. And that too, we only take 1/3 of it for eating, not to throw it away or anything, but to eat. And the 2/3 of it we share with others, with the family and for the poor, so other members, family, friends, and for the poor, 2/3 of it in the tradition of our beloved Prophet Ibrahim. So people need to be educated on that. This is actually a good thing, that the poor people are being given the meat, which lamb they hardly ever eat. It's so expensive when we do that. So anyway, that was one point we discussed, that we were very appreciative of the way Rabbi Gila explained it. Then the second point we said was, upon your comment that you made, saying that an enormous number of Jews are atheists and an enormous number of Muslims are fundamentalist. So the point Mike Ross and Noor made is, gave that 0.001% are that. I would say enormous number of Muslims are traditional Muslims. We practice the same core values of universal brotherhood of humanity, dignity, oneness of God, oneness of humanity, kindness, charity, justice. So we do that. But a particular very small percentage is the fundamentalist, and out of that, a smaller percentage is radical. Those were the 2 points. Thank you.
And just thank you. And just to be clear, when I made that statement, I was not talking about the way the Jews in the room or the Muslims in the room treat other people. I was purely speaking about their theology. So to give numbers, roughly 1/3 of Jewish people in America today would say they do not believe even in a higher power. Roughly 1/3 might be viewed as believing in a higher power creator separate from the universe that was created, who created in accordance with an omnibenevolent will. And then there's 1/3 that believe in a higher power, but they don't believe in that concept. So that's what like poll numbers show. I was simply commenting about a particular group of people who were there at a particular session to illustrate just how different our groups tend to be from one another, even though the faith's theologies are so similar.
Yes.
Okay, can we hear from another group, a representative of another group?
I'll go. So a couple of folks in our group were talking about how internally we know what's right and wrong. That's natural. And then that brought to my mind the idea of conscience. And I raised the issue of how conscience often is counteracted by ego. And people were talking about, well, we need to learn what's right and wrong, or learn how to bring out that inner knowledge. And I was suggesting that if we learn how to subdue the ego, then the conscience can come forward. Because if we have to learn what's right and wrong, that suggests that right and wrong is culturally relative. But I think we all know that universally, there are certain ideas about what's right and wrong. You don't kill, you don't lie, you don't steal. I mean, that's found in every religion, in every culture. And things like the golden rule, that's like a universal also. So I think that's innate to the human nature, but ego gets in the way of actually putting that into action.
I think, Laura, also one of the things we talked about that particularly Salaluddin mentioned is that when we talk about how were our virtues created, or let's say choreographed maybe, would be that listening to one's elders, at least that was for him, listening to his grandmother, listening to his aunts, all of that, growing up in a situation where there was a lot of violence during the years that he was younger really affected him. And so seeing that and then having, you know, his background of listening to the elders and the wisdom that they brought forth really helped him become the human being that he is today. So I think that that also is important. I brought up the concept of mysticism and how that affected me in a deeper way to appreciate the values in a deeper sense from a mystical framework. And Gila, do you have anything you want to add to what we did? Okay.
So Rev
Thank you,
David,
Dan.
no problem. Rev David, you want to share something or should I share my point?
It's muted. There it is.
Yeah,
You have-
it was Dan and myself mainly. We didn't, so we had a conversation between ourselves, and I don't remember any particular highlights of the conversation, but I really appreciate your questions and and how you.
Oh, well, let me say something. I came in very late because I had a conflict, but I was struck by the energy that certainly Dan and David have brought to Jewish life, and the richness you both must feel in setting in motion an opportunity for people to grow in their respective religious traditions and in understanding the broader religious worlds in which they share space and time. And again, we're all indebted in ways we don't even know.
Well, you'll feel less indebted when I make this point, because I want to be provocative. So just before you arrived, I shared what I consider to be both an opportunity and a challenge, just kind of, and maybe sobering. So I've written about my own kind of development in terms of how I became religious, theologically, right? And I don't want to talk about that. I want to go back earlier in time when I was a much more sort of typical, 1960s young Jewish boy who didn't think much of going to services, who didn't think much of going to Jewish school. Mostly I thought about football during Jewish school. Yet I had a Jewish consciousness. Yet it was very important to me to have that Jewish sense of identity. Why? Because I associated with certain values. What values? This deep commitment to education, this general sense of being, fighting for the underdog, fighting for the have-nots as opposed to the haves. All sorts of people who go into public service or social work, whatever, those kinds of occupations. Like we had a ton of people in my family who did that. And growing up in Bethesda, so many people who parents work for NIH, it was almost like a college town. And government employees and whatnot who didn't work for NIH, including my parents. So I had that sense of Jewish values that sort of set Jews apart in my mind. And now I fast forward to today. I don't hear anybody talking about the Jews' commitment to education compared to all other groups. I mean, they're not in Berkeley. They're not trying to keep the Jews out anymore. There are certain other groups they're trying to keep out, right? Or Harvard. When it comes to values, I mean, I can go to a Unitarian Universalist church and hear progressive values constantly, and I don't have to hear about people bashing Israel. So I don't see the Jewish civilization, if you will, separated out from this, in this values sense, from the general society in the 2020s as much as I did, say, in the 1960s. And I would think it would make it more of a challenge for those families who wanted to give their children a sense of Jewish identity, but maybe don't connect so much with ritual or don't go to shul as much. How do they keep the flame lit? It was, I think, easier back then than maybe it is now.
Yeah, I've had a lot of college students who they tell me one of their parents was raised Jewish, and that's the end of it. Once you have that marriage between the Jew and the non-Jew, the Jewish identity inevitably is no longer passed down. I've had a few exceptions, but and
Oh.
so that's something I think is maybe uniquely American. I don't know, but it's kind of a shame. And one thing that came to my mind a lot earlier in our conversation was what's a folk value of the Jews, and I think family fits that. Education and truth. Statistically, American Jews are much more highly educated than other religious groups in America, but family also. And that's why even if you're not religious, if you're atheist, you still identify with Judaism as a culture, as a family heritage.
Just like
Thank
seriously.
you. Go ahead, Rob David.
So
Go ahead.
Laura, I mean, I think I see it and I've experienced differently than you. I work a lot with with families, with individuals who are not connected or haven't been connected for a long time with the Jewish community, and over the years, been helping those individuals and those couples, those families, find connections. Part of what our community has done over the past number of years, we've helped to incubate new Jewish groups. And there's a tremendous emergence of young people trying to find their way within the Jewish world on many different levels, spiritually, but also in terms of how to respond to the issues that we are facing in our society. I can, rattle off maybe 10 new groups that have emerged over the past 10 years alone. And so I do see it differently with intermarriage. Yeah, it's a challenge, but gosh, I do a lot of, over the years, a lot of b'nai mitzvah, b'nai mitzvah, bat mitzvah, and also officiate at various events, baby namings, funerals that involve almost always non-Jews, and I see that there's an interest, there's a desire to be connected, and how those connections are made, is a challenge, and that's something that our community is trying to address. So I see it a little bit differently than you do. I'm much more positive, positive feeling about the.
Well, we're in two very different settings. I'm in the public setting, and you're coming as a rabbi out of a synagogue setting.
No, not in the synagogue setting.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. But
I'm in the community. And I'm pretty public. It's not a traditional synagogue at all. The communities that I've served over the years have all been alternative Jewish communities.
Alternative Jewish communities. So what the people you see are coming to your Jewish community because they want to identify with Judaism to some degree. What I'm seeing in the public college is the general population.
Okay.
So, and I have seen many, many more every semester, every year, more and more Muslims in my classes. I could count on one hand the number of Jews I've had in classes over the past 25 years. And perhaps a few more of those who don't identify as Jewish, but they will say they're dad was Jewish or something along those lines, but they really don't know anything about it. They don't learn anything about it. They don't identify as Jewish because it's not passed down to them.
Laura, I'm sorry I couldn't come for the better part of this discussion. Where are you? Which university are you connected with?
I'm at Nova. I teach at Nova,
At
no-
where?
Northern Virginia Community College.
Oh, okay. I just want to ask you about the Chabad imprint. That seems to have been a catalyst in a number of settings for people to want to learn more. Are they active where you are, Chabad?
Nah, the community college doesn't have religious groups the way like George Mason does. But the community college, it's the community, that we're not a campus. You know, the activities our students are involved in are so widespread, work and family and friends, and they don't hang around the campus to get involved in groups like that.
So I feel very Talmudic in making this statement, but I think there's value in both what Laura and David are saying. I think there is plenty of truth in what you both are saying with your own respective perspectives. What I will say to Laura, though, about the products of intermarriage is that you need to go to see the rabbi at Hill Havarah and talk not only about her background, she's my daughter, but also the statement that they make every on the high holidays, just the most heartfelt expression of love for the non-Jewish spouse or member of the family that brings their children and whatnot to the community. It almost brings me to tears every year. Nor you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a question really, so that I can understand from you guys.
Sure, yeah.
The country today is polarized, means has formed two tribes, Democrat tribe and Republican tribe. I mean, that's the facts. Look in the numbers. So how do you see this polarization and the impact of the polarization to the Jewish community?
Well, very
Can I just say, first of all, isn't this the weekend where the conservative Jews are having all these speakers? Is in Vegas? Isn't that happening now? Anyway,
Yes.
Go ahead, Rabbi David or Rabbi Gila.
No, it is a serious problem.
I'm afraid I have to go. I'm
Oh,
so
and you're
sorry.
not late, and maybe this will be the last. David,
Okay.
Rab David, this will be the last word because
All right.
we're now over time.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi
Thank
Gila.
you so much.
We're all deeply concerned about the polarization in general. In the Jewish community, it's definitely gotten worse. It's always been there, because you can't be a Jewish community without having a number of different opinions about things. And but it's gotten very much more difficult. With organizations that are supporting, Jewish organizations supporting Republican candidates because of mainly their support for Israel, with disregarding their inconsideration for women's reproductive rights and other many other issues, including gun reform, etc. So it is a problem in the Jewish community, and there are those of us who are trying to figure out how to address it. You heard a conversation, was it last week, that Jude sponsored over this definition of anti-Semitism.
Week and a half ago.
A week and a half ago already. Well, it's a serious issue. Who speaks for the Jewish community? And this polarization. How do we deal with it? Now, these are religious or
intra-faith.
Faith, that's the word. Intra-faith issues. Muslims have to also address their intra-faith issues.
Oh yeah.
And we have to address ours. And we're trying. Some of us are trying to figure out how to do that. It's in a civil way, and that can that's the issue. There are organizations popping up, by the way, where Democrats and Republicans are getting together. There's Braver, what's it called, Braver
Angels, Braver Angels.
Braver Angels. That's a good example.
They just, David, they had a workshop yesterday. It's very good.
Yeah. So I've been following them. I get there. I'm on their mailing list. And there are other organizations very similar that have just popped up over the past couple of years. That is I feel hopeful about that. we have to encourage that dialogue. We have to meet face to face more often. Now that COVID is, or the pandemic anyway, is coming to something of a close, I guess. I don't know. But people are feeling more comfortable getting together in person. We need to do that. We need to get back to dialogue, dialoguing with each other. For almost 2.5 years, we had dialogue groups. Some of you may have participated in them in Montgomery County. There were 20 of us or so that were trained to lead these dialogue groups between different segments of the population on racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, etc. We had from 40, the largest group was 100 people came out. And basically, it stopped. We wanted to continue it, but we lost one of our leaders, and then the pandemic came in. That's what we need to do. We need to do, work on the ground, face to face. That's how I feel about it.
Okay. So we're a little after time. I want to thank all of you for giving us up to 2 hours, and in some cases more than 2 hours of your time today. We will put this on the JID's website in a few days, and we look forward to doing the same kind of thing, only instead of Judaism, we'll be looking at Islam, either in December or January. It's always a hard month to schedule things. So either December or January. And again, I want to thank our panelists doing a wonderful job as always. And don't come back many times, David. And thank you, Gila.
Thank you, Dan and Jiz, for doing this. It's wonderful, wonderful work.
Thank you.
So important.
Take care, everybody.
See you. Good to see you.
Thank you.